I didn't think you'd make it.
I managed to grab the last one.
You always save the day. Let's head straight upstairs then.
Nobody warns you that the most dangerous contract you will ever sign is the one you write yourself. Elizabeth Johnson had written this one at 1:47 in the morning, which was a perfectly reasonable hour by her standards. There was a glass of sparkling water to her right, a legal pad covered in notes to her left, and the kind of focused quiet that only existed in her apartment after midnight when Seoul had turned down its volume and stopped demanding things from her. She had been awake for 19 hours. She would be awake for at least 2 more. Sleep in her world was something you scheduled the way you scheduled maintenance on a machine. Necessary, yes, but only when there was nothing more urgent running. If you are watching this video, comment your country and subscribe. There were 6 clauses. She had drafted and deleted a 7th twice before deciding it was redundant. The document was clean, specific, and written in the language of someone who had spent the last 9 years learning that the difference between a good deal and a disaster was almost always in how clearly you define the terms at the beginning. Elizabeth Johnson was 32 years old. She had come to Seoul from Accra at 23 with a duffel bag, a 5-year business plan folded into the front pocket of her carry-on, and the specific brand of immovable determination that her grandmother had always called the Johnson jaw. You could see it on her face when she was resolving something. A slight set to the chin, eyes gone very still, the expression of a woman who had already decided and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. Her mother had cried at the airport, not from sadness, but from the particular proud terror of a woman watching her daughter step into a life she had imagined for her since she was 7 years old and announced she was going to own buildings someday. She owned 4 now. ZMG, Elizabeth Johnson Global, had its name on 4 buildings in Seoul's central business district and its reputation in markets across 3 continents. Last year alone, she had closed 2 deals that landed in the international financial press before the ink was fully dry. She had done all of it without a co-signer, without a patron, without anyone handing her the keys to a single room. Every door she had walked through, she had built herself first. Her parents, still in Accra, kept a folder of her press features and showed it to everyone who visited, the way other families displayed graduation photos. She called them every Sunday morning without exception and made sure she sounded rested even when she wasn't. She was Elizabeth. She handled things, which was exactly why she was now writing a contract for a man she had never met. Clause 1 stated that the arrangement would begin immediately upon signing and conclude no later than 6 months from that date unless both parties agreed in writing to extend it. Clause 2 outlined the minimum public appearance requirements. 2 per week, covering industry events, press-facing dinners, and anything related to the KBA summit review process. Clause 3 was the one she had spent the most time on. It read, "All affection displayed in public settings is performative in nature and carries no implication of personal sentiment or obligation between the parties." She had read it back to herself 3 times and almost added the word whatsoever to the end, but decided it would look like she was protesting too loudly. Clause 4 covered payment, transferred on the 1st of every month, non-negotiable, reflecting full services rendered. Clause 5 was confidentiality, standard and airtight. Clause 6 specified the primary context for the arrangement. The KBA, the Korea Business Authority Summit, and all affiliated board processes connected to the annual review cycle. She almost stopped at 6. Then she added one more. Clause 7. This arrangement is not, under any circumstances, to be mistaken for anything other than a professional agreement between 2 consenting adults with clearly defined mutual interests. She underlined it. Then she stared at the underline and wondered briefly why she felt the need to underline something she was supposedly certain about. She left it underlined. Moved on. The reason for all of this, the reason Elizabeth Johnson, a woman who had built everything she owned from a folded business plan and a Johnson jaw, was now drafting a contract for a man to pretend to be her partner, was a woman named Shin Jiyeon. Shin Jiyeon was the heir to the Shin Group. Not the kind of heir who had to prove herself, not the kind who had climbed anything, the kind who had been born at the top and handed a view. She was 32, same as Elizabeth, which was the most irritating coincidence in an already irritating situation. They had been moving in overlapping circles in Seoul's elite business world for 2 years, always cordial, always watchful. The specific politeness of 2 people who each knew the other was eventually going to be in their way. That eventually had arrived. The KBA summit seat opened every 4 years. One position. The kind of institutional credibility that could shift the trajectory of a company for a decade, board access, government-level contracts, the sort of endorsement that made international partners take your calls instead of returning them 3 days late. There were 2 candidates under serious consideration. Elizabeth was one. Shin Jiyeon was the other. The selection panel had not officially stated their criteria. They never officially stated anything, which was its own kind of statement. But Elizabeth's advisor, Director Kwon, had placed a very carefully worded intelligence briefing on her desk 2 weeks ago, and Elizabeth had read it 4 times before she said anything. They can't require personal stability as a criterion, she had said. They won't require anything. Director Kwon had replied in the tone he used when he was being precise and kind at the same time. It is simply a pattern that has emerged from studying the last 3 selection cycles. The nominees who have been chosen have all presented a certain wholeness. Professionally accomplished and personally grounded. Grounded, Elizabeth repeated. Settled. Present. The kind of person who appears to have a life outside of their company. She had looked at him for a long moment. That's the most aggressively traditional framing I've heard since I moved to this country. I don't disagree, he said. I am simply reporting what the data suggests. What the data suggested was that Shin Jiyeon, who had appeared at no fewer than 51 events in the past year with the same polished, photogenic man beside her, had an advantage that had nothing to do with revenue projections or market strategy, or the 9 years Elizabeth had invested building ZMG into something that made financial journalists in 5 countries reach for their pens. It meant that the one part of her life she had consciously, deliberately, and quite happily left unattended had become a liability. And Elizabeth Johnson did not carry liabilities. She converted them. She wanted to be clear about this even in her own head, someone who had never wanted love. She was not closed off, not damaged, not any of the quiet labels she had heard applied to ambitious women who prioritized their work. She had always found those labels slightly amusing, the way something completely incorrect can be accidentally funny. She was not closed. She was focused. She fully intended to pursue love at some point with the same intentionality she brought to everything else. It was on the list. It was just not at the top. The summit was at the top. It had been at the top for 3 years. So she had put out a discreet inquiry through the most indirect channel available. Her assistant's personal contact, someone with no traceable connection to ZMG, specifying that she was looking for a particular kind of person. Male, Korean, because optics in this environment were a variable she could control, and she was going to control every variable available to her. Professional bearing. The kind of man who could sit at a dinner table with board directors and hold his own without making her look like she had scraped the bottom of a casting call. Non-dramatic. She had used the word twice in the brief and underlined it once. 3 profiles came back. The first she dismissed after 30 seconds. The accompanying photo looked like it had been taken for a fragrance advertisement. She did not need a model. She needed someone believable. The second had included in his initial message a line about whether there was room for the arrangement to evolve organically. She had closed the tab before she finished reading the sentence. The third profile had no photo. Just a name, Park Hyunso, a one-line note that said the terms were acceptable and a time he was free to meet. She had stared at the missing photo for a full minute, trying to decide if the omission was confidence or evasion. She was still deciding when she arrived at the restaurant she had chosen for the meeting. Neutral ground, public space, her usual table near the far wall already reserved. He was already there. He was sitting with his jacket, dark navy, well-cut, worn over a plain white tee, draped over the back of his chair, reading the menu with the focused attention of a man who took food seriously and had not yet noticed her arrival. He was tall even seated. His hair was neat but not styled, the kind of hair that landed on handsome by default rather than effort. When he looked up, it was unhurried, and when he saw her, he didn't perform recognition. He just nodded slightly, the way you nod at someone you've been expecting. Elizabeth Johnson, he said. Park Hyunso, she replied, pulling out her chair. You look exactly like I expected. There was no flattery in it, just observation. And how was that? Like someone who has already decided how this meeting is going to go and is checking whether reality matches the projection. She looked at him. Close. I had 4 possible versions. He almost smiled. Only 4. I was being efficient. She set the contract folder on the table. I'd like to go through the clauses. Can we order first? He said it the way someone states a personal policy, without apology, without negotiation. I've been at the hospital since 6 this morning, and I make bad decisions on an empty stomach. She paused. The hospital? I was visiting someone, he said easily, and picked up his menu again. She stared at him for a moment. Then she picked up her own menu. She had negotiated with ministers. She had restructured a failing acquisition in a conference room at 2 in the morning while her legal team ate cold rice and tried to keep up. She had once delivered a full board presentation 40 minutes after landing from a 12-hour flight, still in her travel clothes, and won the room. She had never been asked to pause contract negotiations to order food. She looked at the menu. Fine. He ordered like a man reuniting with something he had missed. She ordered something small. He noticed, the way she was already beginning to understand, he noticed everything, and flagged the server over without comment and added a side dish she hadn't asked for. She opened her mouth to object. The food arrived too quickly and smelled too good, and she was, if she was being honest, hungrier than she had admitted to herself. She ate it. He said nothing about it. They went through the contract over the meal. He read each clause with the careful attention of someone reviewing something they actually intended to honor, asked 2 clarifying questions, both precise, both reasonable, and signed at the bottom of the last page with a steadiness that suggested he had made his decision before he arrived and was simply completing the formality. So, he said, capping his pen and settling back in his chair. What's the first event? My assistant will send you the 3-week schedule tomorrow. There's a dinner on Friday with the KBA Finance Subcommittee and a gallery event the following Saturday. Both are press-facing. She paused. Dress like someone who belongs in the room. Something moved through his expression. Not offense, just a quiet assessment. Understood. She left the restaurant feeling what she always felt after a clean agreement, organized. Like a variable had been converted from unknown to known and filed in the correct column. This was a transaction. Defined, time-limited, with clear deliverables and a clean exit. She was exceptional at those. She had built her entire company on them. She reminded herself of this, specifically on the walk back to her car. She reminded herself again when she got home. And once more, quietly, before she fell asleep, because she had underlined Clause 7 for a reason, and whatever that reason was, she was fairly certain it had been the correct instinct. She just hadn't known yet how correct. The Friday dinner was at a restaurant in Gangnam, the kind of place that had a waiting list 6 months long and served food that made you feel like you'd interrupted something private. Elizabeth was there at 7:18, 12 minutes before the agreed time, because arriving early was a non-negotiable principle. She was already deep in conversation with 2 KBA advisory board members when the door opened and Park Hyunso walked in. She had told him to dress like someone who belonged in the room. He had done something better than that. He had dressed like someone who owned rooms like this, and had simply chosen to attend this one. Dark trousers, a structured black jacket over a collarless shirt. The whole thing carried with the ease of a man who never once thought about whether he looked right. He didn't scan the room anxiously or pause at the entrance. He simply walked in, found her with his eyes across 30 feet of candlelight and linen, and came toward her like he'd been navigating to her specifically. When he reached her side, he didn't hesitate, didn't do any of the micro-adjustments that would have telegraphed the artifice. Traffic on Tehran Aro was something else tonight, he said in a tone so settled and familiar that it sounded like the tail end of a longer conversation. Like they had been saying things like this to each other for years. She turned to look at him, and he was already looking at her. One eyebrow barely lifted, the faintest signal at the corner of his mouth. I've got this. She felt herself settle in a way she hadn't expected. Park Hyunso, she said, turning to the board members. My partner. The word felt strange in her mouth. Not wrong, just new. Like a key that fit the lock, but hadn't been worn smooth by use yet. The dinner lasted 3 hours. In 3 hours, she learned that Park Hyunso was the specific kind of person rooms adjusted themselves around without noticing. He didn't work a crowd, he inhabited one. He listened when people spoke, which sounds unremarkable until you've sat through enough industry dinners to understand how rare it actually is. He laughed when things were funny. He didn't laugh when they weren't. He asked a KBA infrastructure director a question about a policy she'd mentioned in passing 6 minutes earlier, and the woman's entire face rearranged itself with surprise and pleasure at being remembered that precisely. Elizabeth had known that woman professionally for over 2 years. They had never had a conversation that wasn't about work. In the car afterward, she said, "You're good at that." "At what?" "People." He shrugged, a small, honest one. "People are interesting. Not all of them." He turned to look at her from the passenger seat. "Which ones aren't?" "The ones who only speak to create the impression of speaking." "Ah," he said, nodding slowly. "But even those ones are worth paying attention to. You learn more from how someone performs than from what they're actually saying." She looked at him. "That's unexpectedly sharp. You keep being surprised when I say something sharp." "I'm not surprised. I'm noting it. There's a difference." "Yes," she said, and looked back out the window. Outside, Seoul did what Seoul always did, blazed and moved and asked nothing of anyone passing through it. She had fallen for this city the way you fall for something that perfectly matches your pace. It had never once suggested she slow down. She had always appreciated that about it. "Friday was productive," she said. "It was," he agreed. "You were sharp with the subcommittee chair. That thing you said about regional market recalibration, you could see him filing it away in real time." She hadn't expected that. The precision of it, the fact that he'd been tracking her performance in the room and not just his own. She filed it away and moved on. "The gallery event is Saturday week," she said. "It skews creative. Wear something with a bit of life in it. All black will read as corporate." "Noted. And don't be late." "I was early on Friday." "You were 3 minutes early." 3 minutes is the minimum." He stared at her. "By whose metric?" "Mine." A beat. Then he laughed, a genuine one, surprised out of him. "Okay, I'll be 10 minutes early." She looked back out the window and told herself that what she felt at the corner of her mouth was not a smile. It was a facial response. Involuntary. It meant nothing. The gallery was where things began, quietly and without announcement, to get complicated. Not in any single dramatic moment. Not in a way she could mark on a calendar. It was slower than that, the accumulation of small, unremarkable things that she kept noting and telling herself were exactly that, unremarkable. The way he appeared at her shoulder precisely when a conversation was veering somewhere she didn't want it to go. A journalist who had been angling for something sharp-edged. A former business associate who clearly hadn't accepted that a deal he'd tried to undercut her on 2 years ago hadn't gone his way. And Hyunso redirected both situations with such ease she almost didn't notice the intervention until it was already done. The way he'd caught her standing too long in front of a large canvas at the far end of the gallery. Deep blues and amber gold. The kind of painting that stopped you when you weren't paying enough attention to guard against being stopped. And when she glanced across the room and found him watching her, he hadn't looked away. He'd just tilted his head, like he was adding something to an internal file. When she drifted to the next painting, he fell into step beside her. "You actually love art," he said quietly. "I appreciate it." "No. You love it." You went completely still back there. You stopped moving your hands. She looked down at her hands. They were still. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. "That's fine," he said, like it wasn't a point of contention, just a deposit into something he was keeping. And he moved with her to the next painting and said nothing more about it. She told herself the problem was simply that he was observant. That was an asset in these environments. An inattentive man would have been a liability. His attentiveness was a professional feature. It was useful. It was fine. It was completely, entirely fine. But 2 days later, sitting in her office at 10:40 at night, trying to read a market analysis report, what she was thinking about was the moment they were leaving the gallery. They had been doing the departure round, the handshakes and promises to stay in touch, and she had been tired in the deep, specific way that lives in the bones and doesn't show on the face, and Park Hyunso had done something that was not in any of the 6 clauses. He had placed his hand on her back, not her arm, not a formal guiding gesture. Her back, light, warm, the kind of touch that doesn't announce itself, that simply arrives and stays as if it has always belonged there. And she counted, because counting was what she did when she needed to organize herself. 5 seconds, she had done absolutely nothing. She had kept talking to whoever was in front of her, and she had let 5 seconds of warmth happen, and she had not stepped away immediately, and she had not addressed it. Then the conversation ended, and she moved forward, and the hand fell away. In the car, neither of them mentioned it. At home, she opened her laptop, found the contract, and read Clause 3. All affection displayed in public settings is performative in nature and carries no implication of personal sentiment or obligation between the parties. Performative. She closed the laptop, put on music, the Afrobeats playlist she kept for the nights when her head ran too loud. Asa came on first, then Burna Boy, then Effia, the soft gold sound of a continent she carried in her chest on the nights when Seoul felt very far from everything she was made of. Her parents had named her Elizabeth because her grandmother had told them it meant radiance in the old language, and they had looked at their newborn daughter and decided that was exactly right. She had spent her whole life trying to be worth that name. She sat in her quiet apartment surrounded by everything she had built and listened to the music and thought, firmly and deliberately, about absolutely nothing related to Park Hyunso. She was mostly convincing. Mostly. To everyone else, completely. To herself, not even close. The problem arrived fully formed on a Wednesday, which was the day she had specifically designated for deep work. No appearances, no schedule items, nothing that required her to perform any version of herself other than the one that sat at a desk and built things. Elizabeth was at ZMG by 6:50. At her desk by 7. By 9 she had already cleared her priority list, responded to Director Kwan's briefing notes, reviewed the KBA timeline, and entered the specific mental state she guarded above almost everything else. The deep focus that her team recognized and respected, and had learned not to interrupt unless the building was structurally compromised. Her assistant knocked at 9:17. "There's someone at the front desk. He doesn't have a meeting." Elizabeth looked up from her screen. "Who?" Her assistant had the face of someone being carefully, deliberately neutral. "Park Hyunso." "A beat." "Send him up," Elizabeth said, because there was no sensible alternative. He was technically her partner. Partners visited offices. It was a normal thing that happened between normal people in normal arrangements. He came in carrying 2 coffees and a paper bag from the bakery on Dosendero. She had mentioned it once in passing, in the car after the Friday dinner when she'd said she used to stop there before the morning crowd made it impractical. He had apparently retained this the way he retained everything she said, which she was beginning to understand was completely and specifically him rather than any performance of attentiveness. He set 1 coffee on her desk and sat across from her like this was the 100th time he had done it. "I had a patient follow up 2 streets over," he said. "Early appointment." She paused. "Patient. He said it lightly, not expanding. She noticed the omission and noted it. He did that, offered threads without fully pulling them, left doors unlocked but not open. It was the communication pattern of someone who had learned to be thoughtful about what they volunteered. "You didn't have to bring anything," she said. "I know." He nodded at the bag. "Cinnamon pastry. You strike me as someone who skips the first meal of the day and then powers through on the principle that discipline is a sufficient substitute for nutrition until your body stages a protest sometime in the early afternoon." She stared at him. She had skipped breakfast. She had absolutely intended to power through on principle. That was precisely the plan. "That is a very specific guess," she said. "It wasn't a guess," he said simply. She opened the bag. The pastry was still warm. She ate it at her desk, and somehow, she still wasn't entirely sure how, they were talking, not about the arrangement, not about the KBA, not about anything that fell under the technical jurisdiction of the contract sitting in her filing drawer. He brought up the painting from the gallery because he remembered she had stopped in front of it. She talked about Accra because he asked about it in the context of music. She had mentioned Afrobeats, and then asked real questions, the kind that wanted actual answers, not the kind that are politely waiting for their turn to talk. She told him about growing up in a house where music was structural, not decorative, about the way her grandmother cooked on Sunday afternoons, and how certain smells and souls still caught her off guard sometimes, sent her somewhere else for a moment before she returned. He listened all of it, did not look at his phone, did not redirect to himself, sat in the chair across from her desk, and gave her the full weight of his attention. At some point, she realized she had been talking for 22 minutes about Accra and her family and Sunday afternoons she hadn't allowed herself to miss out loud in years. She stopped. "Sorry." "Don't apologize," he said. "I asked." She looked at him across the desk. The morning came in at an angle through the glass. The office was quiet, and there was something in the room that had not been there at 7. She could not name its source or measure its dimension, and that was precisely the problem. "Hyunso," she said carefully. "Elizabeth," he replied, in the exact same register. "The arrangement has defined parameters. I know dropping by isn't one of them," he said, standing without any visible rush. He picked up his coffee. "Add it to the open items. Finish the pastry. I've eaten half. Finish it." He was already at the door. He paused with his hand on the frame and turned back, and the expression on his face was the one she had started to recognize. Warmer than professional, too easy to be performance, somewhere in between that she had no label for. "You're doing well," he said. "With all of it. The summit prep, the work. You're really doing well." She opened her mouth. Nothing organized itself in time. He left. She sat at her desk in the aftermath of a very quiet Wednesday morning and stared at the half-eaten pastry and thought about Clause 7 with the specific urgency of someone who had written a rule because, on some level below consciousness, they had already suspected they might need it. She finished the pastry. The KBA nominations were announced on a Thursday at 6:40 in the morning. Elizabeth found out because she was at her desk before 6:40, which was simply how her life worked. Director Kwon had sent the confirmation email at 6:22 with the subject line, "Confirmed." 2 nominees. And then, in a detail she would think about later, he had followed it with a second email at 6:23 that said only, "Well done." Director Kwon did not send well done emails. He sent action item lists and briefing summaries. A well done email from Director Kwon was the organizational equivalent of a standing ovation. She read both emails twice. Then she looked at the ceiling for 30 seconds. This was a practice she had built over years, the 30-second window. A defined space to feel something fully, completely, without letting it flood the rest of the day. She had learned that if you didn't give wins and losses their 30 seconds, they had a way of leaking into everything else. 30 seconds for the highs, 30 for the losses, and then forward. She used all 30. The pride was real and deep, the kind that doesn't sit on the surface but runs through the structure. She knew what this nomination had cost. The accumulation of years, each one more focused and more solitary than the last, a life lived in the thin, bright tunnel of building something from nothing. The evenings she hadn't been present for. The invitations she had declined. The version of herself that existed only in this office and in boardrooms and in the focused forward motion of pursuit. She had paid for this nomination in years, and she did not regret a single one, and the pride was the private, clean kind that no press feature could fully capture because it lived in the marrow, in the knowledge of what it had actually cost. 28, 29, 30. She called her mother. It was early in Accra, but her mother answered on the second ring, because her mother always answered on the second ring. A fact Elizabeth had stopped noticing somewhere in her 20s and started noticing again recently in the way you notice gifts you had mistaken for ordinary things. "Mama," she said. "I got it." The sound her mother made had no exact word attached to it. It was something anterior to language, from the part of a person that exists before words were invented. Elizabeth pressed the phone closer to her ear and looked out her window at Seoul assembling itself in the morning light and let herself be, for a moment, simply a daughter who had done the thing her mother always believed she would do. "Your father," her mother said, voice catching. James, come." Elizabeth got it. And then she could hear her father's voice, low and then suddenly wide awake and full of something she had grown up recognizing as the particular frequency of his pride. Different from his everyday voice, fuller, like a room being opened that was usually kept closed. Both her parents talked at once. The beautiful, organized chaos of an Accra household that ran on love and volume, and the specific warmth of people who had always believed in you without making it conditional. She sat in her glass office in Seoul and laughed and told them everything and let herself be fully there for 10 whole minutes, not 30 seconds, because some things deserved more than 30 seconds and she was learning, slowly, at 32, to let them have it. She was still smiling when her phone buzzed. Park Hyunso saw the announcement. "Congratulations, Elizabeth Johnson. You earned it." She read it once. Read it again. Looked at the timestamp. 6:54. He had seen it before she had finished her call with her parents. His first instinct had been to reach for his phone and tell her she had earned it. She typed, "Thank you." Then deleted it. Typed, "How did you see this so early?" Deleted that. Typed "Thank you" again and sent it before she could second-guess it further. His reply, "Dinner tonight. Not for the arrangement, just to celebrate. I know a place." She should have said no. The contract had specific and deliberate parameters, and an unscheduled celebratory dinner fell outside all of them. And the fact that saying no felt like a small internal inconvenience, rather than the clear and obvious correct answer, was itself a data point she should have been paying much closer attention to. She typed, "Send me the address." Told herself it was practical. She had been working long days and tended to forget to eat during concentrated stretches of work, and he had apparently made it his quiet ongoing project to prevent this, which was a professional quirk of the arrangement and nothing more. The place he had in mind was a small restaurant in Mapo tucked into a side street with no English sign and maybe 12 tables, and the kind of low light that exists in restaurants where the food has nothing to prove. It smelled extraordinary from the doorway. An older woman met them at the entrance, greeted Hyunso by name with the warmth of long familiarity, and looked at Elizabeth with the specific evaluating kindness of someone updating a story they had been following for some time. First time bringing someone, the woman said, not quietly in Korean. Ajiasi, can we just get the table? Hyunso said, in the tone of someone surrendering. The woman smiled at Elizabeth. For years he's been coming here. Always alone. Always the same seat. The corner table would be wonderful, thank you, Hyunso said. Elizabeth pressed her lips together and studied the wall with great attention. They sat. He was faintly pink in a way she had not seen before, which was new data, which she catalogued automatically. For years, she said once they were seated. Elizabeth. Always the same seat. I'm not going to discuss this. I'm just repeating what I heard, she said and smiled. It was the real one. Not the one she wore at industry events, not the one for cameras, but the one that arrived without permission when something actually reached her. She didn't use it often enough to have developed control over it. It simply appeared. He looked at her when it appeared. The way he looked at her, direct, warm, with something in it that had the quality of stillness, like a held note, was something she clocked and then deliberately moved past, the way you step over something without breaking your stride. The food came, and it was extraordinary. The kind of meal that made you pause mid-sentence simply to be honest about what was happening. They ate and talked, and the conversation moved on its own logic, freely and without agenda. She told him about the summit in real terms, not the polished version she gave to press or to the board, but the actual stakes of it, what it meant for ZMG and what it meant for her. He listened and asked questions that told her he had been paying attention to her work across the weeks. Not performing interest, but actually building a picture of what she was doing and where it was going. You've been reading about my company, she said. You're my partner, he said easily. I should know what you do. Most people in this kind of arrangement would do the minimum. He tilted his head. What kind of arrangement do you think this is now? She paused. You know what I mean. I know what you mean, he agreed. And the way he said it meant something slightly different from what she had meant, and both of them understood that, and neither of them named it. The conversation moved the way it always moved, like water finding the next available path. The older woman brought something sweet without being asked, setting it between them with a particular smile aimed at Elizabeth that felt like a verdict. The restaurant had emptied around them at some point without either of them noticing. Elizabeth looked up and found it was past 10 o'clock, and she had spent almost 3 hours here without once checking her phone for messages. She checked now. A few things from Director Kwan, all summit-related, all manageable in the morning. I should go, she said. I know, he said. He didn't move immediately. Neither did she. She noted this and chose not to examine it. In the car she watched the city, and he sat beside her and did not fill the silence, which was the thing she kept coming back to. He never filled silence unnecessarily. He had somehow worked out the architecture of her mental space without her providing blueprints, and was operating inside it with a precision that should have unsettled her more than it did. Thank you, she said. For tonight. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. I'm choosing to. He turned to look at her. The city moved across his face in patterns of light. You're allowed to just receive things, Elizabeth. You don't have to make every exchange balanced. I built everything I have by keeping things balanced. That's business, he said. This is different. What is this? The question came out more open than she intended, the kind that escapes through gaps in your guard when your guard is occupied elsewhere. She watched him process it. Something moved through his expression, careful and certain and warm. I don't know yet, he said. But it doesn't feel like the contract. It is the contract, she said. Okay, he said. Not agreeing. Just receiving. She got home and stood at her window and put on the music and did not sit down for a long time. She thought about the nomination and about the dinner and about the fact that he had messaged her at 6:54 in the morning, before she had even fully processed the news herself, and his first instinct had been to tell her she had earned it. She thought about how he had known, how he had seen it before she called her parents. And how when she got his message later and read the words, what she had felt was not satisfaction or convenience or the clean settlement of a task completed. What she had felt was something warmer and more specific than any of those words. She opened the contract on her laptop. Read Clause 7. Closed the laptop. Went to bed. Lay on her back in the dark and thought about how the problem with building walls was never the construction. She was exceptional at construction. The problem was when someone came along who wasn't trying to demolish anything, who was simply quietly, with patience and precision, learning where every door was. And she could feel, in the way you feel things before you can name them, that he had been memorizing the layout for months. The Shin Jiyeon situation escalated on a Tuesday evening at a pre-summit mixer that Elizabeth had been expecting to be difficult. What she had not anticipated was the specific form that difficulty would take. She had known Shin Jiyeon would move. Jiyeon did not respond to competition by going quiet. She responded by accelerating, by making herself more visible, more polished, more undeniably present. Since the nominations had been announced, the Shin camp had maintained a pointed silence that had nothing to do with withdrawal and everything to do with preparation. Elizabeth had kept one eye on it the way you keep one eye on weather. The mixer was semi-formal, held in the upper function room of a hotel in Gwangwon, the kind of event where business cards were exchanged and alliances quietly tested, and no one said anything that could be taken out of context because everyone present understood the game too well to leave openings. Elizabeth worked it the way she worked everything, methodically, precisely, with the ease of someone who had spent a decade making these environments hers. She was mid-conversation with a procurement director when Shin Jiyeon materialized at her left side with a smile that had been engineered to look like warmth. Elizabeth, congratulations on the nomination. Jiyeon. Elizabeth matched her register exactly. Likewise, Shin Jiyeon was striking in the way of someone who had never once had to negotiate for attention in a room and had therefore never developed the habit of noticing when attention was being noticed. She was in a deep burgundy gown, structured at the collar, fluid from the waist down, and she wore the whole thing with the ease of someone who had been photographed since childhood. Beside her, her date, well-suited, careful posture, attention directed with studied precision in exactly the right direction, was doing his very best with a role he had not fully settled into. Elizabeth read this in about 4 seconds, the same way she read rooms. "I didn't see your partner this evening," Jiyeon said, with a particular lightness that was the precise opposite of casual. "I hope he's well." "He'll be here shortly," Elizabeth said, with a confidence she had not technically earned, because Park Hyunso was not on the schedule for this evening and she had not confirmed anything with him. She excused herself from the conversation smoothly and found a quiet corner and pulled out her phone. "Elizabeth, are you available?" The reply came back in under a minute. "Hyunso, define available." "Elizabeth, I need you at the Grand Silla Hotel, Myeongdong Ballroom, in 30 minutes. "Hyunso, that's not scheduled." "Elizabeth, I know." A pause. Longer than his usual pauses. "Hyunso, is everything all right?" She looked across the room at Shin Jiyeon, who was watching her from a measured distance with the practiced smile of someone who knew they were being watched and found it useful. "Elizabeth, it will be 30 minutes. "Hyunso, I'll be there in 22. She put her phone away, straightened her shoulders, and went back to working the room. She moved from cluster to cluster with the precision and ease of someone who had spent years making herself comfortable in every available uncomfortable space. She was good at this. She had built her reputation partly on being exceptional at exactly this. Reading rooms, placing herself, knowing when to speak, and when to let the silence do the work. He arrived in 20 minutes. She didn't see him come through the door. She felt the shift in the room's attention from 20 feet away, the particular way a space adjusts when someone enters it who wasn't expected and whose energy is difficult to ignore. And she located him easily because he was already moving toward her with the unhurried certainty that was simply how he moved through the world. He was wearing a deep charcoal jacket over a black dress shirt, something sharper than his usual register, something that understood the room precisely and had decided to meet it without surrendering any of himself in the process. He greeted the trade attaché she was speaking with by name. She had no idea how he knew the name, with the warm efficiency she had come to recognize as his baseline rather than any performance of it. Then he turned to her and lowered his voice so only she could hear. "Where is she?" Not "what's wrong" or "what do you need?" Just "where is she?" For words that confirmed he had read the situation from a forward text, and arrived already oriented. Something moved in Elizabeth's chest. She corrected for it and nodded subtly toward the far side of the room. He looked, found Jiyeon. 3 seconds. Looked back at Elizabeth with the particular calm that said, "I see it. I have it." Then he did something that was not in the contract. He reached over and took her hand. Not a look-this-way performance. Not a guiding gesture for the audience. He took her hand the way you take the hand of someone whose hand you have been taking for a long time, easy and certain and without any announcement, and held it while she continued her conversation with the trade attaché, and the conversation continued without a break in its rhythm. Across the room, she registered the moment Shin Jiyeon saw it. The slight recalibration, the fraction of a shift in the practiced smile. Elizabeth kept talking. She did not look at their hands. She did not look at him. She also did not let go. Not for the next 45 minutes. Not until the event was winding down and the room was thinning and the gallery of observers had largely dispersed. Even then, it was Hyunso who eventually carefully stepped back. And the absence of his hand felt like something she did not have a word for. She looked for the word on the drive home. She did not find it. And that, more than the gallery, more than the Wednesday morning coffee, more than the dinner in Mapo, was when she understood with the quiet finality of a thing that has been true for a while and has simply decided to announce itself, that she was in a significant amount of trouble. Not the summit kind. The other kind. The kind she had been planning to get to later. The contract's expiration date was printed clearly in Clause 1. In the precise legal language she had written herself on a Wednesday night in January when she had been completely certain that 6 months was more than sufficient. She had been staggeringly, completely wrong about that. She understood this fully on the last Thursday of the 6 months, when she woke at 6, made coffee, stood at her window, and looked at Seoul in the early gray light, and thought about the fact that today was technically the final day of the agreement with Park Hyunso, which was supposed to feel like an orderly conclusion, and instead felt like standing at the edge of something she had not chosen to stand at the edge of. She drank her coffee. She did not contact him. She went to work. The 4 months between the nomination and the KBA final review had been the most demanding period of her professional life, which was a significant statement given that her professional life had never once been described as undemanding. The board presentations, the one-on-one interviews, the public profile assessments, the series of pressure test events where the committee was watching not just what you said, but how you said it, what you revealed under scrutiny, whether you were the kind of person who held shape when the environment pushed against you. She had walked into every single one prepared in the bone-deep way that only comes from a lifetime of preparation. She knew the ZMG story in every direction, the revenue story, the vision story, the human story. The version that started with a 23-year-old from across stepping off a plane in Seoul with a folded business plan and a grandmother's jaw, and the absolute refusal to accept any version of this city that didn't eventually include her. In the final board interview, she had told that story with a clarity that made the room go quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when something true is being said. Not impressed quiet. Just quiet. Hyunso had been at every public event through those 4 months. Every dinner, every reception, every press-facing appearance where the visible version of their arrangement needed to be its most convincing. He had been impeccable in every room, and somewhere in those months, without a moment she could pinpoint as the precise transition, he had also become something else. He had started arriving at her office on Wednesday mornings without her asking, with coffee, and staying for anywhere from 20 minutes to an hour, and the quality of his presence had begun to reorganize the rhythm of her mornings without her authorizing it. Her assistant had stopped announcing him at some point. She had not noticed exactly when. He left books on the corner of her desk. Not with notes, not with instructions or recommendations, just placed, as if they had always been there, as if he knew she would understand why he had thought of her when he saw them. She read every single one. He had met her parents over video call in a way that had not been planned by anyone. Her mother had called on a Sunday evening while Hyunso happened to be at her apartment, and they had been reviewing summit presentation documents, which was true, and also not the full picture of how the evening had been spent. Her mother had said, "Put the phone where I can see the room," in a tone that had no optional quality to it, and Hyunso had simply leaned into frame and said "Annyeonghaseyo," and then attempted something in Chui that was phonetically a disaster and conceptually exactly right. Her mother had laughed so hard she had to hand the phone to her father. Her father had looked at Park Hyunso on that small screen with the measuring look she had grown up recognizing, the one he used when he was conducting a thorough and quiet assessment of something that mattered. Treating her right? He had asked, in the specific tone of a man who had been waiting 32 years for someone to sit in his daughter's life and was not asking a casual question. I'm working on it, Hyunso had said, with the honesty of someone who meant it in multiple directions at once. Her father had nodded, just once slowly, but she knew her father's nods. That one had been an entire paragraph. Afterward, when the call ended and it was just the two of them in the quiet of her apartment, she had looked at Hyunso and said, "You didn't have to do that." "I know. My father is going to remember that conversation." "Good," he said. She had looked at him for a long moment. "Hyunso." "Elizabeth," he said, her name in a different register, not the deflection he sometimes used when she was over-organizing something that didn't require it. Different. The way you say a name when you mean what comes after it. "The arrangement ends in 3 weeks, she said. "I know when it ends. I just want to make sure we're—" "I know when the contract ends," he said. "I also know that I haven't been inside the contract for a long time." The apartment was very quiet. Seoul made its usual noise beyond the glass. "Define a long time," she said, because she was Elizabeth Johnson, and even in moments like this, she needed coordinates. He considered it with the same seriousness he brought to things that mattered to him. "The cinnamon pastry," he said. "I knew at the cinnamon pastry." She stared at him. "That was week 2. "I know. That was week 2 of a 6-month arrangement." "I know," he said again with the same calm. "I signed the contract, and then I met you, and I spent about 10 days convincing myself I was going to stay inside the terms. And then I brought you breakfast and watched you eat it at your desk while you talked about Accra, and I understood that I was not going to manage that. I want you to know I found it extremely inconvenient." She stood very still. "You never said anything." "You had the summit," he said simply, like it explained everything. Like the choice to wait, to fold himself around the shape of what she needed for months without placing any of his own timeline on her. Like that had just been the only available option, obvious and unambiguous. You had something that mattered enormously to you that you had been working toward for years. I wasn't going to put something on you that you'd have to manage on top of everything else. The feeling that moved through her then was large enough to require a vocabulary she didn't have. It was the specific sensation of being known. Not the visible parts, not the impressive parts, not the ZMG founder, youngest woman press feature parts. The actual parts. The part that called her mother every Sunday. The part that stood in front of paintings and forgot to keep moving. The part that ate breakfast at her desk and talked about home and was underneath all the floors she had built and all the rooms she had structured. A woman from Accra who had wanted something very much and had gone after it with everything she had and had sometimes, in the long quiet nights of all those years, been lonely in a way she had never given herself permission to name. She crossed the room and stood in front of him. "I knew at the hand," she said quietly. He looked up at her. "The mixer," she said. "You just took it. You didn't ask. You didn't make it a thing. You took my hand like you'd been doing it for years, and I spent the entire drive home trying to find a word for what that felt like." "Did you find one?" "No. I gave up on the word. I just kept the feeling." He stood up. They were close. The apartment was quiet. The Afrobeats playlist she had been running on low was doing what music does when the room it's filling is trying to tell you something. Asa singing the way Asa always sang on Sunday evenings, the sound of where she came from inside the apartment she had built in the city she had chosen. Park Hyunso looked at her with the expression she had been refusing to name for 6 months. She stopped refusing. "The contract ends in 3 weeks, he said. "I know. I'd like to not be in the contract after that." "What would you like to be instead?" she asked. He thought about it with genuine care. "The person who brings you coffee on Wednesday mornings. Without a clause." She looked at him. "That's a very modest ask for someone who has been very patient." "I'm starting small," he said. "I have a list." She laughed. The real one, the one she'd spent her life deploying with precision, and that he had been quietly, consistently extracting from her for months, as if he had found the frequency, and was simply too polite to press it too often. She laughed, and he smiled, and the space between them stopped making any logical sense as a concept. So she closed it. Because she was Elizabeth Johnson, and when something made sense, she moved toward it without holding a negotiation with herself about it first. She kissed him first. She would remember that later with a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with the particular joy of choosing something clearly, without conditions, without a clause. He kissed her back like he had been waiting since week 2. The KBA decision came on a Monday. Elizabeth was in her office. She had been in her office since 6:40, which was late for her, but which she had granted herself as a small concession to the fact that she had not slept particularly well. Director Kwon was standing near the window in the way of someone who had made a private agreement with himself not to pace. His version of restraint involved standing very still while the interior of him did something that wasn't still at all. Her senior team had arranged themselves around the room with the controlled expressions of people who had invested too much to perform casualness about the outcome. Elizabeth's phone rang at 9:17. She answered it. She listened. She said, "Thank you. I'm honored," in the tone she used when something was real but the moment was not yet hers to expand. She hung up. Director Kwon looked at her. "We have it," she said. The room did not respond the way rooms respond in films, all at once in a single coordinated release. It came out of people at different speeds, in different registers. Her head of strategy made a sound she hadn't heard from him before. Her communications director grabbed the arm of the person beside her. Someone was crying and trying to hide it with mixed success. Director Kwon, who punctuated every communication with periods and had never in her experience deployed a single exclamation point in a professional context, closed his eyes for a moment and exhaled very slowly, and that small measured release from him was the equivalent of anyone else throwing open a window and shouting into the street. 3 years of summit preparation, 9 years of foundation before that, 12 years of building something from nothing in a city that had not made room for her until she made the room herself. Elizabeth stood in the middle of it and let the 30 seconds expand. She let it be longer than 30 seconds. She was learning to let things be the size they actually were. She thought about her parents, about Accra and the grandmother who had named her for radiance, about 23-year-old Elizabeth on a plane with a folded business plan and a jaw set against every version of this that didn't work out, about the person she had been and the person she had built herself into and all the night hours between those two people, paid without audience or complaint. She thought about Park Hyunso. She texted him before anyone else. "Elizabeth, we got it." His reply came in 9 seconds. "Hyunso, I know. Congratulations, Elizabeth Johnson. You were always going to." Then, after a pause, "Hyunso, I'm outside your building. I brought jerk chicken from that place you mentioned on Itaewon-aro." She laughed so suddenly and so completely that Director Kwon looked at her with the expression of a man encountering something outside his models. Park Hyunso was waiting in the ZMG lobby with a bag of food and his jacket slightly open and the easy, unhurried look of someone who had decided to be somewhere and was not particularly concerned about how long he had to wait there. When she stepped out of the elevator, he looked at her and smiled, not the performance smile, not the dinner event smile, but the one she had come to understand was simply what his face did when he was genuinely glad about something. "You're really here," she said. "Where else would I be?" he said. They ate in her office with the city spread out below them, and she told him the parts she hadn't been able to text, the sound of the room, the way Director Kwon had closed his eyes, the particular release of 12 years arriving at a single phone call. He listened the way he always listened, entirely, and asked the kind of questions that told her he understood the full weight of what she was describing. "You're going to be extraordinary in it," he said. "I'm going to work very hard at it," she replied, because that was the honest answer. "Same thing," he said. "For you." She looked at him across the desk with the remains of the best celebration meal she had ever had between them, and thought about the fact that 6 months ago she had sat at a restaurant table in Gangnam and handed this man a contract with 7 clauses and had been absolutely certain she knew exactly what she was building. A clean transaction, defined parameters, a professional tool deployed for a specific purpose. She had been wrong in a way she could now fully appreciate for its scale. What followed was not a love story of the clean and frictionless variety. Elizabeth had always found frictionless things slightly suspicious, as if they were hiding something or had never been tested. There were real arguments, not banter, actual disagreements between two people who were both strong directional and had specific ideas about how things should work. She went deep into work cycles sometimes, the kind where the hours disappeared and she resurfaced 2 days later slightly gaunt and running on the specific adrenaline of a long, focused push, and he told her about it directly, without softening it or delivering it as a concern instead of what it was. She didn't always receive it gracefully. She was not built for graceful receiving, and he had learned this about her in the same way he had learned everything else, by paying attention until the picture was clear. He had habits, too, a tendency to make decisions about small logistical things in her life with a certainty that occasionally crossed from attentive into assuming, and she called him on it every single time, without softening the call, because softening wasn't in her register, and he respected that, even when the unfiltered version landed with more force than she had intended. The fact of him being a doctor had surfaced approximately 3 weeks after the contract signing, not because he had been hiding it, but because she had never asked what he did. She had asked whether he could fulfill the arrangement, and he had said yes, and that had been the extent of it. She had discovered the full picture at a hospital charity event his colleague had insisted he attend, where she had stood in a room full of people who clearly held him in substantial professional regard and turned to him and said, "Explain this to me right now." He had explained it with the sheepishness of someone who had suspected correctly that earlier disclosure might have altered the texture of something he had wanted to keep unadorned. "You never asked," he said. "You never told me. You asked if I could do the arrangement. I could. Everything else was relevant," she said. "Additional," he said. "I thought if you knew from the beginning, you might." "What?" "Treat it differently," he said simply. "Treat me differently. Like something you were performing for, instead of something you were just talking to." She had stared at him for a long, considered moment. "I find that extremely irritating," she said. "I know. And it changes nothing." He smiled the slow one. "I know that too." She pointed at him. "Irritating," she said again, and walked back into the event. He followed, laughing quietly, and took her hand on the way in, and she let him. The proposal was on a Sunday evening. She would tell the story later and note that it was exactly right for who he was, which was a significant part of why it was exactly right for her. There was no reservation, no prepared speech, no strategic location selected for its visual merit. He was not that kind of person, and she would not have wanted him to be. This was one of the many ways they fit together in the specific manner of two people who had found the exact right shape. They were in her apartment. The Afrobeats playlist was running on low. She had been reading on the couch, a novel he had left on her desk 3 weeks ago, and he had been on his phone, and the room had the comfortable quiet of two people who had learned that being in each other's presence without performing for each other was its own kind of intimacy. The good kind. The kind that takes time to build and doesn't announce itself, but is unmistakable once it's there. He looked up from his phone at some point and looked at her for a long moment without speaking. She looked up from her book. "What?" "Marry me," he said. Conversational. The tone of a thought that had found the right moment to come out of his mouth and had decided a quiet Sunday was moment enough. She put her book down. "Hyunso." "Elizabeth." That was not a question. "No," he agreed. "It was a statement. I'm stating that I would like to marry you. You can respond however you choose." She looked at him across the couch. This person who had arrived in her life in the wrong venue for all the right reasons, who had signed a contract and then, quietly, patiently, with the settled certainty of someone who had made a private decision early and was simply waiting for her to travel the same distance in her own time, had dissolved every clause she had ever written from the inside out. He had brought her breakfast and left her books and taken her hand without asking and learned where Accra lived in her voice and told her she was doing well when she was running on empty and told her the truth, even when it was inconvenient, and sat on a video call with her father and said I'm working on it and had meant it in every available direction. "Yes," she said. He smiled. "Was that difficult?" "Enormously," she said. "Don't make it a thing." He laughed and crossed the couch, and she laughed too, and the music played the way the right music plays on Sunday evenings, filling the apartment she had built in the city she had chosen, the sound of where she came from inside the life she had made. She found out she was pregnant 6 weeks later. It was a Tuesday morning. She was in her office at 7:15, which was where she was every Tuesday morning. She had taken the test in the private bathroom adjoining her office because she was Elizabeth Johnson and she handled things in the most organized available environment. She stood looking at the result for considerably longer than 30 seconds because this did not belong inside the 30-second system, and she was beginning to fully understand that the things in her life that mattered most had a persistent tendency to exceed her systems. She called Hyunso. He answered on the first ring. "Morning. Did you eat?" "I'm pregnant," she said. Silence. "Hyunso." "I'm here." His voice was different, lower, careful, the specific quality of a person receiving something large and real. I'm here. Are you at the office? Yes. I'm coming. You don't have to. Elizabeth. His voice had the steady warmth she had come to understand was the bedrock of him, the thing that stayed constant when everything else was variable. I'm coming. She sat on the edge of her desk and looked out at Seoul and waited. 14 minutes later, he walked through her door, slightly out of breath, jacket not quite straight, moving with the speed of a man who had ignored the traffic logistics and come anyway, and crossed the room directly to her and pulled her into him. She pressed her face against his shoulder and held on. He held on back. Outside the glass, Seoul continued its permanent bright motion, indifferent and magnificent, asking nothing and offering everything. Inside, Elizabeth Johnson was 32 years old and had everything she had spent her life building, and also something she had not known she was building toward until it had walked through her office door with the wrong kind of outfit for a contract meeting and signed her careful document, and then, with extraordinary patience and attention, quietly made every clause in it obsolete. In her filing drawer, the contract sat exactly where she had put it, all 6 clauses intact. Clause 7 underlined, in the handwriting of a woman who had been absolutely, completely certain she knew what she was agreeing to. She had been wrong. She had never been happier about anything in her life. What Elizabeth learned: the things you build with your hands will always be yours. But the things that find you when you finally stop holding the door closed, those belong to a different kind of strength. The kind that doesn't build walls. The kind that opens windows. What Park Hyunso knew from week 2. Some people are worth every clause you have to sign to get close enough to show them who you are. Hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me your favorite moment from the whole series. I read every single one. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next story.
I'm sure you enjoyed the story. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Tell us the country you're watching from. Share our video with your loved ones. And we love you. Like catch you next video. Let's go.